The scorching Arizona sun had been Eleanor Davenport's lone companion for miles, until she finally collapsed, her body burning with fever just 5 miles from Tombstone. When she awoke days later in a stranger's cabin, the blue-eyed cowboy who called himself Daniel Garrett didn't know if she would live or die, but he was determined not to let her face either fate alone in this unforgiving territory. Eleanor's eyelids felt like lead as she struggled to open them. Her throat was so parched, it seemed lined with sandpaper, and her head pounded mercilessly. Fragments of memory drifted through her consciousness: the stagecoach, the robbery, being left behind after fighting with the bandits. How long had she walked? The last thing she remembered was the sun beating down on her shoulders as she stumbled forward, hoping to reach Tombstone before nightfall. "You're awake." The deep voice came from somewhere to her left. Eleanor turned her head slightly, wincing at the pain the small movement caused. A man sat in a wooden chair beside the bed. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that spoke of years under the harsh western sun. His brown hair was slightly unkempt, and he had several days' growth of beard. But it was his eyes that captured her attention, a startling blue that stood out against his tanned skin. "Where am I?" she managed to croak. "My cabin, about 5 miles outside of Tombstone." He stood and moved to a small table, returning with a cup of water. "Here, small sips." He gently supported her head as she drank. The water was cool and felt like heaven against her parched throat. "Thank you," she whispered when she had finished. "How did I get here?" "Found you collapsed on the trail while I was heading back from town." He set the cup aside. "You've been unconscious for nearly 2 days, burning with fever. I wasn't sure you'd wake up." Eleanor tried to sit up but found herself too weak. 2 days. Easy now." His hand on her shoulder was gentle but firm. "You're still weak. The fever hasn't fully broken yet." "I'm Eleanor Davenport," she said, settling back against the pillow. "I was on my way to Tombstone when the stagecoach was attacked." "Daniel Garrett," he replied. "Most folks just call me Dan." He frowned. "You were left behind after a robbery," she nodded slightly. "I fought back. One of them tried to take my mother's locket. They knocked me unconscious and left me there." Her hand went instinctively to her neck, panic rising when she didn't feel the familiar weight of the gold pendant. Seeing her distress, Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a delicate gold locket. "Looking for this? I took it off while you were thrashing in fever, figured it must be important to you." Relief flooded through her as he placed it in her palm. "Thank you, it's all I have left of her." "You should rest now," he said, standing up. "I'll make some broth." "You need to get your strength back." "Why are you helping me?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel paused at the door, his expression unreadable. "Out here we help folks who need it. It's how we survive." With that, he left the room, closing the door softly behind him. Left alone, Eleanor took a moment to examine her surroundings. The room was small but clean, with a window that looked out onto pine trees. She was wearing a man's shirt that swam on her frame. Daniel must have changed her out of her sweat-soaked clothes. The thought should have scandalized her, but in her current state, she could only feel grateful. She had come west to start a new life, to escape the suffocating constraints of Boston society after her parents' deaths had left her virtually penniless. Her aunt in Tombstone had written offering her a home and the promise of teaching position at the local school. Now she lay in a stranger's bed, miles from her destination, too weak to even stand. Eleanor clutched the locket tightly. She had survived this long. She would recover, thank this kind cowboy properly, and continue on to Tombstone. This was just a delay in her journey, not the end. Daniel returned shortly with a steaming bowl of broth. "Think you can sit up a bit to eat?" With his help, Eleanor managed to prop herself against the pillows. Her hands trembled too much to hold the spoon steadily, so Daniel sat on the edge of the bed and fed her himself, his movements surprisingly gentle for such large, calloused hands. "Have you lived here long?" she asked between sips. "About 5 years. Have a small ranch." "Nothing fancy, but it's mine." There was quiet pride in his voice. "No family," a shadow crossed his face. "Not anymore. Lost my wife and son to cholera 3 years back." "I'm sorry," Eleanor said softly. "I know what it's like to lose family." "My parents died within months of each other last year." Daniel nodded, a moment of understanding passing between them. "You mentioned Tombstone. You have people waiting there. My Aunt Martha, my father's sister. I'm to live with her and teach at the school. Martha Davenport." Daniel's eyebrows rose. "I know her. Respectable woman, makes the best apple pie in the territory." Eleanor smiled weakly. "That sounds like Aunt Martha. She always sent us preserves at Christmas." The effort of talking had exhausted her, and her eyes grew heavy. "Rest now," Daniel said, taking away the half-empty bowl. "The fever might come back tonight. I'll be close if you need anything." As Eleanor drifted off to sleep, she heard him moving quietly around the cabin. Despite the circumstances, she felt strangely safe in this stranger's home, miles from anywhere in the Arizona territory of 1883. The fever did return that night with a vengeance. Eleanor tossed and turned, caught in nightmarish visions of the stagecoach robbery, of her parents' funerals, of endless desert with no water in sight. Through it all, she was vaguely aware of a cool cloth on her forehead, of strong arms lifting her to drink, of a steady voice murmuring reassurances. By morning, the fever had broken again, leaving her weak but clear-headed. She opened her eyes to find Daniel asleep in the chair beside her bed, his head at an awkward angle that would surely give him a stiff neck. In sleep, the hard lines of his face softened, making him look younger than she had initially thought, perhaps not much older than her own 24 years. As if sensing her gaze, Daniel stirred and opened his eyes. For a moment, he looked at her with unguarded concern before his expression shifted to a more neutral one. "Morning," he said, straightening in the chair. "Fever broke about dawn. How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd of cattle," Eleanor admitted. "But better than yesterday," he nodded, standing to stretch his tall frame. "Good. You had me worried there for a while. Did you stay there all night?" A faint flush colored his cheekbones. "Wanted to make sure the fever didn't get worse. I've seen how quick these things can turn bad." "Thank you," she said simply. Daniel looked uncomfortable with her gratitude. "I'll get breakfast started. Think you might be up to some eggs and maybe a little bread." The mention of food made Eleanor realize she was actually hungry for the first time since arriving. "Yes, I think I could manage that." "Good." He seemed relieved to have a task. "There's a basin of water there if you want to wash up a bit. I left one of my clean shirts for you. Your dress was pretty much ruined by the time I found you." Eleanor glanced at the folded shirt on the nearby chair and the basin of water on the small table. "That's very kind of you." After Daniel left, Eleanor managed to push herself up to a sitting position, though the effort left her dizzy for a moment. She used the cloth and water to wash her face and hands, then attempted to tame her tangled hair with her fingers. The effort exhausted her, but it felt good to be clean. By the time Daniel returned with a tray, she had managed to change into the fresh shirt, which hung to her knees. Her own undergarments had been washed and dried, she discovered, and she tried not to think about the cowboy handling such intimate items. "You look better," he commented, setting the tray across her lap. "I feel more human, at least." She looked down at the simple meal: scrambled eggs, a slice of bread with butter, and a cup of coffee. "This looks wonderful." Daniel pulled the chair closer to the bed. "Eat what you can." Don't force yourself. Eleanor took a small bite of the eggs, surprised at how good they tasted. You're quite the cook, Mr. Garrett. Dan, he corrected. And when you've lived alone as long as I have, you either learn to cook or eat poorly. He watched her eat for a moment. I sent word to your aunt yesterday. Asked Joe Miller to stop by her place when he was heading into town. She knows you're safe. Relief washed over Eleanor. Oh, thank you. She must have been worried when I didn't arrive. Joe's bringing back the doctor when he returns. Should be here by midday. Eleanor paused with her fork halfway to her mouth. A doctor? Is that necessary? I'm feeling much better already. Daniel's expression grew serious. Desert fever's nothing to take lightly, Miss Davenport. I've seen strong men laid low for weeks. Better to have Doc Sullivan take a look. Eleanor, she offered. If I'm to call you Dan, you must call me Eleanor. A slight smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Eleanor, then. She managed about half the eggs and a few bites of bread before her energy began to flag. Daniel took the tray away without comment when she indicated she was finished. Would you mind opening the window? She asked. I'd like to feel the fresh air. Daniel crossed to the window and pushed it open, letting in a breeze that carried the scent of pine and sage. It's a fine day out there. Not too hot yet. Eleanor closed her eyes, savoring the fresh air. It's beautiful country, so different from Boston. Boston, Daniel raised an eyebrow. That's a long way to travel alone. I had little choice, she said simply. After my parents died, there was barely enough money to pay their debts and purchase the stagecoach ticket. Daniel nodded, asking no further questions about her circumstances, which Eleanor appreciated. She was in no mood to explain how her father's failed investments had left her nearly destitute, or how the suitable marriage her mother's friends had tried to arrange for her had been with a man 3 times her age. I should let you rest before the doctor arrives, Daniel said, moving toward the door. Would you mind? Eleanor hesitated. Would you mind staying a while longer? I've been alone with my thoughts quite enough these past days. Daniel paused, then nodded and returned to the chair. What would you like to talk about? Tell me about your ranch, she suggested. How did you come to settle here? A genuine smile transformed his face, erasing years from his appearance. Well, that's a story that starts with a foolish young man who thought he knew everything about life. For the next hour, Daniel told her about growing up in Texas, about riding with a cattle drive to Arizona territory, about falling in love with the land and scraping together enough money to buy his small spread. He spoke of the challenges drought, cattle thieves, harsh winters, and of the rewards the satisfaction of building something with his own hands, the beauty of the desert sunrise, the freedom of the open country. He spoke little of his wife and son, only mentioning that he had met Rebecca in Tombstone, where she had worked at the general store. Eleanor didn't press him on the subject, recognizing the pain that lingered behind his eyes when he briefly mentioned their names. By the time hoofbeats announced the arrival of the doctor, Eleanor felt she had glimpsed the man behind Daniel Garrett's reserved exterior, a man of principle and quiet strength, a man who had known love and devastating loss, a man who chose to live apart from others, but hadn't lost his capacity for kindness. Dr. Sullivan was a gruff older man with spectacles and a no-nonsense manner. He examined Eleanor thoroughly, listening to her breathing, checking her pulse, and asking pointed questions about her symptoms. Well, Miss Davenport, you've had a close call, he finally pronounced. Exposure and dehydration, complicated by a nasty fever. You're lucky Garrett here found you when he did. Will she recover fully? Daniel asked from where he stood by the door. The doctor nodded. Given proper rest and care, yes, but it will take time. I wouldn't recommend traveling to town for at least 2 weeks, possibly 3. 2 weeks, Eleanor exclaimed. But I can't impose on Mr. Garrett for so long. Surely I could recover at my aunt's home. Dr. Sullivan shook his head firmly. The journey to town, even by wagon, would be too taxing in your condition. You need complete rest for at least a week, no exertion whatsoever. Eleanor looked at Daniel in dismay. I can't ask you to shelter me for so long. Daniel's expression remained unreadable. It's no trouble. I have the space. But your work I can manage, he cut her off. It's settled. The doctor packed his bag. I'll leave some powders for fever if it returns. Plenty of fluids, light foods at first, build up to heartier fare as she regains strength. He handed a small packet to Daniel. I'll stop by again in a week to check her progress. After the doctor left, an awkward silence fell between them. Eleanor twisted the bedsheet between her fingers, feeling intensely uncomfortable about the situation. I'm sorry to be such a burden, she finally said. Daniel leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed over his chest. You're not a burden, Eleanor. Like I said, out here we help each other. Your aunt sent some things for you with the doctor. He nodded toward a small carpet bag in the corner. Said she'll visit when the doctor says it's all right. That's kind of her. Eleanor hesitated. And kind of you. I don't know how I'll ever repay your generosity. No need to think about that now. Daniel pushed away from the door. You should rest. I've got some work to do outside, but I'll be within earshot if you need anything. After he left, Eleanor sank back against the pillows, conflicted feelings warring within her. She was grateful for Daniel's care, but deeply uncomfortable at being so dependent on a stranger, particularly a male stranger. In Boston, such an arrangement would be scandalously improper. But this wasn't Boston, and Daniel Garrett had shown himself to be nothing but honorable. Still, the prospect of spending weeks in his home left her with a strange flutter in her stomach that she couldn't entirely attribute to her illness. The next few days established a routine. Eleanor spent most of her time sleeping or reading the few books Daniel had on his small shelf, a volume of Emerson's essays, a dog-eared copy of The Last of the Mohicans, and surprisingly, a collection of Shakespeare's sonnets. Daniel brought her meals, checked her temperature, and sat with her for short periods, usually during the evenings when his work was done. Their conversations gradually became less stilted as they grew more comfortable with each other's company. On the fourth day, Eleanor felt strong enough to sit in a chair by the window for a short time. Looking out, she got her first real view of Daniel's ranch. It wasn't large, but it was well maintained with a small barn, a corral with several horses, and in the distance, a field where she could make out cattle grazing. It's lovely, she said when Daniel came to check on her. He followed her gaze out the window, a hint of pride crossing his features. It's not much compared to the big spreads, but it's enough for me. How many cattle do you have? About 60 head. Planning to expand next year if the market prices hold. Eleanor watched as he moved around the room, straightening things that didn't need straightening. She had noticed he was always in motion, as if standing still was uncomfortable for him. You must miss Boston, he said abruptly. The question surprised her. Some things, the libraries, the concerts, being able to walk down a street without getting dust in my skirts. She smiled slightly. But I don't miss the pretense. Everyone's so concerned with appearances and social standing. And you weren't. I was raised to be, she admitted. But after my parents died and I saw how quickly our friends disappeared when our money did. She shrugged. It changes your perspective. Daniel nodded, understanding in his eyes. Loss has a way of doing that. They were quiet for a moment, the shared experience of grief creating a bridge between them. Are you up for a visitor tomorrow? Daniel asked, changing the subject. Your aunt is quite determined to see you. Says she's bringing pie, Eleanor brightened. I'd like that very much. I haven't seen Aunt Martha since I was a child. She's well respected in Tombstone. Volunteers at the church, helps with the school, bit of a force of nature, if you don't mind my saying." "That sounds like the aunt I remember," Eleanor laughed. "She used to scandalize my mother by speaking her mind at every opportunity." "She still does that," Daniel confirmed with a hint of a smile. That evening, Eleanor managed to walk from the bedroom to the main room of the cabin for supper, leaning on Daniel's arm. The main room combined a kitchen area with a small sitting space dominated by a stone fireplace. Everything was simple but immaculately clean, with a few handmade touches: a colorful quilt draped over the back of a rocking chair, hand-woven baskets on a shelf, a braided rug on the plank floor. "Your wife's touches?" Eleanor asked gently, nodding toward the quilt. Daniel's hand brushed the fabric as he helped her into a chair at the table. "Rebecca loved color, said the desert had enough brown without bringing it inside." A sad smile briefly crossed his face. "The cabin seems emptier without her little bits of brightness." "It's still a lovely home," Eleanor said sincerely. They ate a simple meal of stew and cornbread. Eleanor was surprised to find her appetite returning, and she managed a full portion. "You're getting your strength back," Daniel observed as he cleared the plates. "Thanks to your care." Eleanor folded her hands in her lap. "Dan, I've been thinking. Once I'm well enough, perhaps I could help around the cabin. I can't contribute financially right now, but I could cook and clean while you're working outside." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. "You don't need to earn your keep, Eleanor. I'm not keeping score." "I know, but I'd feel better contributing something. I'm not accustomed to being idle." He considered this, then nodded. "If it makes you feel better, but only when the doctor says you're ready." "I don't want to face your aunt's wrath if you have a setback on my watch," Eleanor smiled. "Is my aunt so fearsome? Let's just say I've seen hardened miners quail under Martha Davenport's disapproving stare." The mental image made Eleanor laugh, a genuine, unrestrained sound that seemed to catch Daniel by surprise. For a brief moment, something warm flickered in his blue eyes before he turned away to wash the dishes. Later, as he helped her back to the bedroom, Eleanor found herself acutely aware of his hand supporting her elbow, of the clean scent of soap and outdoors that clung to him, of the careful way he matched his long stride to her slower pace. "Thank you," she said as they reached the bedroom door. "For everything." Daniel met her eyes briefly, then looked away. "Get some rest, Eleanor. Tomorrow will be a busy day with your aunt's visit." As she settled into bed that night, Eleanor realized that for the first time since her parents' deaths, she felt something other than grief or anxiety about the future. Here, in this simple cabin with its quiet, reserved owner, she felt a tentative sense of peace. The next morning brought Aunt Martha, a whirlwind of energy in a practical gray dress, her silver-streaked hair pulled into a severe bun that did nothing to soften her sharp features. She swept into the cabin carrying a basket laden with food and immediately embraced Eleanor, who had managed to dress in the simple calico dress her aunt had sent with the doctor. "My dear girl, when you didn't arrive on the stagecoach, I feared the worst. Then to hear you'd been robbed and left for dead." Martha held Eleanor at arm's length, examining her critically. "You're too thin, but considering what you've been through, you look remarkably well." "Thanks to Mr. Garrett," Eleanor said, glancing toward Daniel, who stood awkwardly by the door as if uncertain whether to stay or give them privacy. Martha turned to him. "Indeed, Mr. Garrett, the town owes you a debt for your kindness to my niece. I've brought some provisions as a small token of my appreciation." "That wasn't necessary, Mrs. Davenport," Daniel said, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. "Nonsense. Now sit down, both of you. I've brought chicken pie and apple cobbler, and I want to hear everything about this ordeal." Over the meal, Eleanor recounted her journey and the stagecoach robbery, careful to minimize the more frightening aspects to spare her aunt undue worry. Martha, in turn, filled Eleanor in on Tombstone, the school where she would be teaching, the small house they would share, the social circles they would move in. There are several respectable, unmarried gentlemen in town who will be quite interested in making your acquaintance, Martha said with a meaningful glance at Eleanor. Judge Parker's son Thomas, for one, Harvard-educated and set to take over his father's practice. Eleanor caught the slight stiffening of Daniel's shoulders at this line of conversation. Aunt Martha, I've hardly recovered from my journey. I'm not looking for suitors. Martha patted her hand. Of course, dear. There's plenty of time for that once you're settled. The conversation turned to practical matters: how long until Eleanor could travel to town, what she would need for her teaching position, arrangements for retrieving her trunk that had been stolen during the robbery. I've already spoken to Sheriff Wilson, Martha said. He's got a description of the men and your belongings. If they try to sell anything in the vicinity, he'll know. That's very thorough of you, Aunt, Eleanor said, touched by her relative's efficiency. Well, we take care of our own out here. Martha glanced between Eleanor and Daniel with a shrewd expression. Speaking of which, while I understand the doctor's concerns about moving Eleanor, I do worry about propriety, Mr. Garrett. A young, unmarried woman staying alone with a bachelor. Aunt Martha. Eleanor felt heat rush to her cheeks. Daniel's face remained impassive. I understand your concern, Mrs. Davenport. If you prefer, I can sleep in the barn until Miss Davenport is well enough to travel. That won't be necessary, Martha said after a moment's consideration. You've proven yourself a man of character, Mr. Garrett, and frankly, at your age, both of you should be beyond such foolishness. She fixed them with a stern look. Still, people will talk. We'll simply have to weather it. The rest of the visit passed more pleasantly, with Martha regaling them with town gossip and stories about the colorful characters of Tombstone. By the time she prepared to leave, Eleanor was exhausted but happy to have reconnected with her spirited aunt. I'll visit again in a few days, Martha promised, embracing Eleanor. Mr. Garrett, I expect you to send word immediately if her condition changes. Yes, madam, Daniel agreed solemnly. After Martha left, an awkward silence fell between them. Daniel busied himself storing the food Martha had brought while Eleanor sat at the table, too tired to move just yet. Your aunt is formidable, Daniel finally said. Eleanor laughed softly. That's a diplomatic way of putting it. She means well. She cares about you. He hesitated. If you're concerned about propriety, I'm not, Eleanor interrupted. Aunt Martha was just being Aunt Martha. I trust you completely, Dan. His eyes met hers, surprised and perhaps a bit moved by her simple declaration of trust. Thank you. That evening, Eleanor was too tired to get out of bed for supper, so Daniel brought a tray to her room. He sat in the chair while she ate, telling her about his day's work to distract her from her fatigue. I've been thinking about what your aunt said, he said after a pause in the conversation. People in town will talk. Eleanor set down her fork. Does that bother you? He considered the question carefully. Not for myself. I've never much cared what people think of me, but you're just starting out here. Your reputation will survive, she finished for him. Anyone who would judge me for accepting help when I was ill is not someone whose opinion I value. Daniel studied her with new respect. You're not what I expected, Eleanor Davenport. What did you expect? From a Boston society lady? Someone more concerned with appearances, I suppose. Eleanor smiled wryly. I might have been once, before life taught me what truly matters. She yawned, unable to suppress her exhaustion any longer. You should rest, Daniel said, taking the tray. Good night, Eleanor. Good night, Dan. The days began to take on a rhythm. Eleanor grew stronger, able to stay up longer, to move around the cabin more freely. True to her word, once Dr. Sullivan gave his approval on his second visit, she began to take over some of the household tasks. She insisted on cooking, finding satisfaction in the simple acts of preparing meals and seeing Daniel's appreciation of her efforts. They settled into an unexpectedly comfortable domestic arrangement. During the days, Daniel would work his ranch while Eleanor rested, read, or handled light chores inside. In the evenings, they would share dinner and conversation, gradually revealing more of themselves to each other. Eleanor learned that Daniel had grown up poor in East Texas, the son of a tenant farmer. He had left home at 16 after his father's death, working cattle drives across the Southwest until saving enough to buy his small ranch. He had met his wife Rebecca when delivering cattle to Tombstone, courted her for 6 months, and brought her to his newly built cabin as a bride. In turn, she told him about her sheltered upbringing in Boston, her love of books and learning, her brief rebellion when she had secretly applied to Radcliffe College against her parents' wishes, only to have her hopes dashed when her father's financial troubles made such aspirations impossible. "Would you go back to Boston if you could?" Daniel asked one evening as they sat on the small porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Eleanor considered the question. "No," she said finally. "Even if the circumstances were different, I don't think I would. There's something about this place." She gestured toward the vast landscape before them. "It's honest somehow. Demanding, yes, even harsh at times, but honest." Daniel nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That's what drew me here too. The land doesn't care who your family is or what clothes you wear. It only cares if you're strong enough, smart enough to meet its challenges." "And are you strong enough?" Eleanor asked, looking at his profile in the fading light. A shadow crossed his face. "I thought I was once. Then I lost Rebecca and John, and I wasn't sure anymore." Eleanor reached out impulsively and touched his hand where it rested on the arm of his chair. "Yet here you are, still standing." Daniel looked down at her hand on his, then slowly turned his palm up to clasp her fingers. "Here I am," he agreed softly. They sat like that, hands joined, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Eleanor was acutely aware of the warmth of his calloused palm against hers, of the gentle strength in his fingers, of the strange flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with her recovering health. When they finally went inside, something had shifted between them, subtle but undeniable. As Daniel helped her to her bedroom door, their hands brushed, lingering a moment longer than necessary. "Good night, Eleanor," he said, his voice lower than usual. "Good night, Dan," she replied, suddenly unable to meet his intense blue gaze. That night, Eleanor lay awake long after she should have been asleep, thinking about the quiet cowboy who had saved her life and was now, somehow, beginning to claim a piece of her heart. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Eleanor was in the kitchen kneading dough for bread when the sound of approaching horses drew her attention. Daniel, who had been mending a saddle on the porch, stood and moved his hand instinctively toward the rifle that hung by the door. "Stay inside," he told Eleanor, his voice tense. Through the window, Eleanor watched as 3 riders approached 2 men and a woman. The woman rode side saddle in a fine riding habit, her posture rigid with propriety despite the dust of the trail. Daniel relaxed slightly as the riders drew closer. "It's all right," he called to Eleanor. "It's the Templetons from the big ranch to the north." Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron and moved to the doorway as the riders dismounted. The woman was perhaps 40, with a stern face and elaborate riding costume that seemed impractical for the territory. One man was clearly her husband, with silver hair and an air of authority. The third rider was younger, perhaps 30, with fashionable clothes and a self-assured manner. Garrett, the older man, greeted Daniel with a nod. "Been a while." "Mr. Templeton," Daniel returned. "Madam," he added with a respectful nod to the woman. "What brings you out this way? Heard from Sullivan you had a guest recovering here." "A Boston lady," he said. "Amelia insisted we pay a call." Templeton's tone suggested he had been given little choice in the matter. The woman dismounted with her husband's assistance, her sharp eyes taking in Eleanor's simple dress and apron. "You must be Miss Davenport. I am Amelia Templeton. This is my husband, George, and our son, Frederick." Eleanor stepped forward, suddenly conscious of her work-worn appearance. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Templeton. Please, come inside." The Templetons followed her into the cabin, Mrs. Templeton's gaze sweeping critically over the modest furnishings. Frederick Templeton, meanwhile, kept his attention fixed squarely on Eleanor, a calculating interest in his eyes that made her uncomfortable. "We've brought some preserves and a few books," Mrs. Templeton announced, gesturing to her son, who produced a small package. "I thought you might be lacking proper reading material and such. Rustic surroundings." "That's very kind of you," Eleanor said, accepting the package with a gracious smile despite the implied criticism of Daniel's home. As Eleanor served coffee and the biscuits she had baked that morning, she became increasingly aware of the undercurrents in the room. Mrs. Templeton addressed most of her questions to Eleanor, skillfully extracting information about her background, education, and plans in Tombstone. Mr. Templeton occasionally exchanged terse comments with Daniel about cattle and water rights, their conversation revealing a long-standing tension. Frederick said little but watched Eleanor with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "You must be looking forward to taking up your teaching position," Mrs. Templeton said, "though I imagine it will be quite a step down from the educational standards you're accustomed to in Boston." "I'm looking forward to the challenge," Eleanor replied diplomatically. "Aunt Martha speaks highly of the children's eagerness to learn. Martha Davenport is a fine woman, if somewhat provincial in her views," Mrs. Templeton sniffed. "Still, I'm sure with your background you might aspire to something more than the Tombstone schoolroom." Frederick leaned forward. "Indeed, Miss Davenport, a woman of your refinement deserves better than dusty Tombstone." Daniel, who had been silent for some time, shifted in his chair. Eleanor noticed his jaw tighten. "I find Tombstone quite charming," she said firmly, "and the people have been exceedingly kind." "Some more than others, it seems," Mrs. Templeton remarked with a pointed glance between Eleanor and Daniel. "Though I must say, your arrangement here is rather unconventional." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Mr. Garrett saved my life, Mrs. Templeton. The doctor insisted I recover here rather than risk the journey to town." "Yes, of course," Mrs. Templeton said, her tone making it clear she found the explanation insufficient. "Still, a young woman of good family living unchaperoned with a bachelor." "I assure you Mr. Garrett has been the perfect gentleman," Eleanor said, unable to keep a hint of frost from her voice. An awkward silence fell. Mr. Templeton cleared his throat. "We should be heading back, getting late." As they prepared to leave, Frederick Templeton lingered behind his parents. "Miss Davenport," he said in a low voice, "I would be honored if you would permit me to call on you once you're settled in Tombstone. Perhaps I could show you some of the more civilized aspects of the territory." Before Eleanor could respond, Daniel appeared at her side. "Your parents are waiting, Templeton," he said, his voice neutral but his posture unmistakably protective. Frederick's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Of course. Until we meet again, Miss Davenport." He tipped his hat and followed his parents outside. After the Templetons rode away, Eleanor and Daniel stood on the porch watching the dust trail dissipate in the afternoon light. "I apologize for their visit," Daniel finally said. "The Templetons fancy themselves the aristocracy of the territory. They own the largest cattle ranch for 100 miles. You don't care for them," Eleanor observed. Daniel's expression hardened. "George Templeton has been trying to buy my land for years. Doesn't like having a small rancher wedged between his property and the water rights I hold." "And Frederick," a muscle twitched in Daniel's jaw. "Frederick Templeton is used to getting what he wants. Be careful around him." Eleanor studied Daniel's profile, noting the tension in his shoulders. "You sound concerned." He met her gaze directly. "I am." The simple admission hung between them, weighted with unspoken meaning. Eleanor felt a rush of warmth at his protective instinct, even as she recognized the complex social dynamics at play. "The Templetons' opinion doesn't matter to me," she said softly. Daniel's expression softened slightly. "It might when you're living in town. They have influence. Then it's fortunate I've never been particularly concerned with following social expectations," Eleanor replied with a small smile. For the first time that afternoon, Daniel smiled too, the tension leaving his shoulders. "No, I don't suppose you have." That evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Eleanor found herself thinking about the Templetons' visit and what it revealed about Daniel's place in the community. He was respected but isolated, a man who kept to himself by choice but also by circumstance, neither fully accepted by the wealthy ranchers nor connected to the townsfolk. "Will you come to town sometimes, after I've gone to live with Aunt Martha?" she asked suddenly. Daniel looked up from the piece of harness he was repairing, surprise evident in his expression. "I don't go to town much, only when necessary." "But you might come for a visit," Eleanor pressed. "For Sunday dinner, perhaps. I'm sure Aunt Martha would be pleased to have you." He studied her face in the firelight. "Would you want that?" "Yes," she admitted simply. "I would." Something shifted in his blue eyes, a spark of hope, quickly guarded. "Then perhaps I will." The following week brought Eleanor's recovery to the point where Dr. Sullivan declared her fit to travel to town. The news, while expected, brought a surprising hollowness to Eleanor's chest as she packed the few belongings that had accumulated during her stay, the books from Mrs. Templeton, a shawl Aunt Martha had brought, the mended dress she had been wearing when Daniel found her. Daniel had been quieter than usual all day, going about his chores with a grim efficiency. When Eleanor emerged from the bedroom with her small bag, he was standing by the fireplace, staring into the flames. "Dr. Sullivan says Aunt Martha will come tomorrow with the wagon," she said, setting her bag by the door. Daniel nodded without turning. "I heard." Eleanor moved to stand beside him, uncertain what to say. The past 3 weeks had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. She had arrived at this cabin half dead, a stranger in a strange land. She would leave it stronger not just in body, but in spirit and with a connection to this quiet, honorable man that defied easy definition. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Daniel turned to face her then, his expression unguarded for once. "You don't need to thank me, Eleanor." "Yes, I do." She stepped closer. "You saved my life. You opened your home to me. You—" She faltered, uncertain how to express what his kindness had meant to her. "I did what anyone would have done," he said, though they both knew that wasn't true. "Will you come to town, like we discussed?" she asked, searching his face. Daniel hesitated. Would Sunday be too soon? Relief and joy blossomed in Eleanor's chest. Sunday would be perfect. That night, their last night together in the cabin, brought a strange mixture of sadness and anticipation. They lingered over supper, neither quite ready to end the evening. After the dishes were cleared, Daniel surprised Eleanor by bringing out a battered checkerboard. "Thought you might enjoy a game," he said with a tentative smile. "Rebecca and I used to play in the evenings." The mention of his late wife, offered freely rather than reluctantly, touched Eleanor deeply. "I'd love that." They played 2 games, Eleanor winning the first and Daniel the second. Their conversation flowed easily, punctuated by comfortable silences. When the hour grew late, neither seemed willing to be the first to suggest retiring. "I'll miss this," Eleanor finally admitted, gesturing to the space between them. "Our evenings together." Daniel's eyes met hers across the table. "So will I." The simple acknowledgement held more meaning than pages of flowery declarations might have. Eleanor felt her heart quicken as Daniel reached across the checkerboard to gently take her hand. "Eleanor," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "these weeks with you have been—" A sudden pounding at the door interrupted whatever he had been about to say. Daniel released her hand and rose quickly, his expression shifting to alertness as he reached for his rifle. "Who's there?" he called, positioning himself between Eleanor and the door. "Garrett, it's Joe Miller." "Open up." Daniel unbolted the door to reveal a young man, dusty from the trail and clearly agitated. "Joe, what's wrong?" "Fire at the Wilkinson place," Joe panted. "Bad one. They're calling for every able-bodied man. Sheriff sent me to round up help from the outlying ranches." Daniel's face grew grim. "The Wilkinsons have young children. Everyone's safe, but they're trying to save the barn and livestock," Joe explained. "Town's forming a bucket brigade." Daniel turned to Eleanor, conflict evident in his expression. "I have to go." "Of course you do," she said immediately. "Go help them." He hesitated only a moment longer before grabbing his coat and hat. "Bar the door behind me. I'll be back as soon as I can." After they left, Eleanor secured the door and moved to the window, watching until the 2 riders disappeared into the darkness. The cabin felt suddenly emptier than it had at any point during her stay. Whatever Daniel had been about to say remained unspoken, the moment lost. Eleanor slept fitfully that night, waking at every sound, hoping to hear Daniel returning. When dawn broke with no sign of him, she rose and made coffee, watching the trail from the kitchen window. It was mid-morning when she finally spotted a single rider approaching, not Daniel, but Aunt Martha, arriving a day early in a small buggy rather than the expected wagon. Eleanor rushed outside to meet her. "Aunt Martha, you've heard about the fire." Martha nodded grimly as she descended from the buggy. "The whole town was up all night fighting it. They managed to save most of the barn, thank the Lord, but Jim Wilkinson still got a hard road ahead." She looked at Eleanor closely. "I thought I'd come early, dear." With Mr. Garrett likely to be occupied with the firefighting and aftermath, it seemed a good time to bring you to town. Disappointment coursed through Eleanor, though she knew the decision was practical. "Of course. I just need to gather my things." "And leave a note for Mr. Garrett," Martha added with surprising gentleness. "It wouldn't do to have him return to find you gone without a word." As Eleanor packed, she wrote a brief note thanking Daniel again for his care and confirming that she looked forward to seeing him on Sunday. The words felt inadequate compared to what she truly wanted to express, but with Aunt Martha waiting, there was no time for anything more eloquent. He placed the note on the table where he would be sure to see it, then took a last look around the cabin that had been her home for nearly a month. Her gaze lingered on the checkerboard, still set up from their unfinished game the night before. "I'm ready," she told Aunt Martha, though her heart whispered otherwise. The journey to Tombstone took most of the day, with Aunt Martha driving the buggy at a careful pace to avoid jostling Eleanor. As they approached the town, Eleanor took in her first real view of her new home, a bustling community of wooden buildings and canvas tents, dominated by the larger structures of Allen Street, the main thoroughfare. Aunt Martha's house was on a quieter side street, a neat white clapboard structure with a small garden in front. Inside, it was meticulously clean and modestly furnished, with handmade quilts and crocheted doilies adding touches of color to the practical surroundings. "Your room is upstairs, dear," Aunt Martha said, showing Eleanor to a small but pleasant chamber with a narrow bed, a bureau, and a desk beneath the window. "I've put fresh linens on the bed, and there's water for washing in the pitcher." "It's lovely, Aunt Martha. Thank you for taking me in." Martha patted her cheek affectionately. "Your family, child. Now you rest while I prepare supper. Tomorrow's soon enough to introduce you to the town." That night, lying in her new bed, Eleanor found herself missing the sounds of Daniel's cabin, the creak of the wooden walls as they settled, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft footfalls of Daniel moving about in the main room. The town, even on this quiet street, had different noises, occasional voices passing by, the distant piano from the saloon on Allen Street, the regular footsteps of the night watchman. Sunday seemed very far away. The next days passed in a whirlwind of introductions and orientations. Aunt Martha proudly presented Eleanor to the school board, the minister, the Ladies' Aid Society, and seemingly everyone else in Tombstone. Eleanor's status as a Boston-educated teacher garnered respect, while her recent illness and dramatic rescue by Daniel Garrett made her an object of fascination. Some of the town matrons eyed her with barely concealed speculation when Daniel's name was mentioned, and Eleanor quickly realized that her extended stay at his ranch had indeed become a topic of gossip, just as Mrs. Templeton had implied. "Pay them no mind," Aunt Martha advised briskly when Eleanor mentioned it. "People will always talk. What matters is carrying yourself with dignity." On Saturday, Eleanor visited the school where she would begin teaching in another week. It was a simple one-room building with rows of desks, a blackboard, and shelves of well-worn books. The current teacher, Mrs. Henderson, was retiring due to her advancing years and seemed relieved to hand over her responsibilities. 32 pupils, ages 6 to 16, Mrs. Henderson told Eleanor. "Most are eager enough to learn, though some of the older boys would rather be working with their fathers than studying their letters." Eleanor ran her hand along the teacher's desk, excitement building despite her nervousness. This was why she had come west, to build a new life, to contribute something meaningful. That evening, she helped Aunt Martha prepare for Sunday dinner, knowing that Daniel had been invited to join them after church. She took special care with the apple pie, remembering that Daniel had mentioned it was his favorite. "You're fond of him, aren't you?" Aunt Martha asked directly as they worked side by side in the kitchen. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Mr. Garrett was very kind to me." "That's not what I asked, Eleanor." Aunt Martha's shrewd eyes missed nothing. "I've seen how your face changes when his name is mentioned." Eleanor hesitated, then decided honesty was best with her forthright aunt. "Yes, I am fond of him, very fond." Martha nodded, unsurprised. "He's a good man, quiet, keeps to himself since he lost his family, but honest and hardworking." She paused in her task of chopping vegetables. "The Templetons won't approve, of course. They have their eye on you for young Frederick." Eleanor looked up sharply. "The Templetons have no say in my life." "No, they don't," Martha agreed with satisfaction. "Just be prepared for some resistance. Amelia Templeton fancies herself the arbiter of society here, limited though it may be." Sunday morning dawned clear and bright. Eleanor dressed with special care in her best dress, a deep blue that brought out the color of her eyes. She arranged her hair in a simple but flattering style, securing it with the tortoiseshell combs that had been her mother's. As she and Aunt Martha walked to church, Eleanor found herself scanning the gathering crowd for Daniel's tall figure. Disappointment settled in her stomach when the service began with no sign of him. Throughout the sermon, she found it difficult to concentrate, her mind wandering to the cabin outside town. Had Daniel received her note? Was he delayed by ranch work? Or had he changed his mind about coming to town? The service ended and still there was no sign of him. Eleanor followed Aunt Martha home, trying to hide her disappointment as they prepared the final touches for dinner. "He'll come," Aunt Martha said with surprising gentleness. "The man rode 15 miles into town every other day while you were ill, just to get news from the doctor about your condition. He won't stay away now." This revelation startled Eleanor. He did, indeed. Caused quite a stir, Mr. Garrett suddenly appearing in town regularly after months of hardly seeing him. Martha smiled slightly. That's when the gossip really started. Just as they were setting the table, a knock sounded at the door. Eleanor's heart leaped as Aunt Martha went to answer it. Daniel stood on the porch, hat in hand, wearing a clean shirt and his least worn pair of trousers. His hair was damp from recent washing and he'd trimmed his beard. He looked uncomfortable but determined. "Mrs. Davenport," he greeted Martha formally. "Thank you for the invitation." "Come in, Mr. Garrett," Martha replied, stepping aside. "We're just about to serve dinner." Daniel entered, his eyes immediately finding Eleanor where she stood by the table. Something in his expression softened, a tension leaving his shoulders. "Miss Davenport," he said, his voice low. "You're looking well." "Mr. Garrett," she returned, unable to keep the smile from her face. "I'm glad you could come." The initial awkwardness faded as they sat down to dinner. Conversation flowed more easily than Eleanor had feared, with Aunt Martha skillfully drawing Daniel out about his ranch, and Eleanor sharing stories about her first days in Tombstone. When Eleanor brought out the apple pie she had made, Daniel's eyes lit up with appreciation. "You remembered," he said quietly when Martha briefly left the room to fetch cream. "Of course I did," Eleanor replied, their eyes meeting in a moment of shared understanding. After dinner, Aunt Martha announced that she had promised to visit an ailing friend. "I'll be gone at least 2 hours," she said, fixing them both with a pointed look. "I trust you two can entertain yourselves appropriately in my absence." Once she had left, an awkward silence fell. Eleanor and Daniel sat in the small parlor, suddenly unsure without Martha's mediating presence. "How have you been?" Eleanor finally asked. "I heard the fire at the Wilkinsons' was quite serious." Daniel nodded. "We worked through the night, managed to save most of the barn and all the livestock. Jim's got neighbors helping him rebuild what was lost." "That's what makes this place special, isn't it? How people help each other." "It is." Daniel leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Eleanor, the night of the fire, there was something I wanted to say to you." Eleanor's heart quickened. "Yes, these past weeks, having you in my home." He paused, searching for words. "After Rebecca and John died, I thought that part of my life was over. The part where I shared meals and conversation with someone, where I had a reason to come home at the end of the day." His blue eyes met hers directly. "You woke something in me that I thought was dead." Eleanor moved from her chair to sit beside him on the sofa. "Dan, I know it's too soon," he interrupted. "You're just starting your life here. You hardly know me, but I wanted you to know that I care for you. More than I thought I could care for anyone again." Emotion welled in Eleanor's throat. She reached for his hand, twining her fingers with his. "It's not too soon," she said softly. "Not for me." Daniel's eyes searched hers, hope warring with disbelief. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I care for you too." Eleanor smiled, feeling suddenly light. "Very much." The tension in Daniel's face gave way to a smile that transformed him, erasing the lines of grief that had become so familiar. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he raised his free hand to touch her cheek. "May I?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Eleanor nodded, her heart racing as he leaned forward to press his lips gently against hers. The kiss was tender, almost reverent, conveying more than words could express about the connection that had grown between them. When they parted, Daniel kept his forehead pressed against hers for a moment. "I never expected to find you," he whispered. "Not out here, not after everything." "Neither did I," Eleanor admitted. "But I'm grateful every day for that fever that led me to your door." They spent the rest of the afternoon talking, making plans, sharing hopes. Daniel would come to town each Sunday for dinner. Eleanor would visit the ranch when school allowed. They would court properly, respecting the conventions of the town while nurturing the deeper understanding that had already formed between them. When Aunt Martha returned, she took one look at their faces and smiled knowingly. "Well, it's about time," was all she said as she hung up her bonnet. As autumn progressed into winter, Eleanor settled into her role as Tombstone schoolteacher. The children, after an initial period of testing her authority, responded well to her enthusiasm and genuine interest in their progress. The parents, seeing their children flourishing, welcomed her into the community. Daniel became a regular visitor to town, attending church each Sunday and taking dinner with Eleanor and Aunt Martha afterward. Sometimes they would walk together along the quieter streets, talking about their week and planning for the future. Not everyone approved of their courtship. Amelia Templeton made her displeasure known, both directly and through the social circles she influenced. Frederick Templeton's initial interest in Eleanor cooled to barely concealed hostility when it became clear she preferred the company of the modest rancher to his own. "The Templetons have been unusually aggressive about water rights lately," Daniel confided to Eleanor during one of her visits to the ranch in early December. "George has filed challenges to my claims, trying to force me to sell." Eleanor frowned, concerned. "Is there anything to be done?" Daniel sighed, looking out over his land. "The law is on my side, but the Templetons have money and influence. It's wearing, constantly fighting them." She took his hand, studying his profile. "Would you ever consider selling, starting fresh somewhere else?" He turned to her, surprise in his eyes. "Would you want that?" "I want you to be happy, Dan. If that means leaving here, this is my home," he said firmly. "I built it with my own hands. I brought Rebecca here as a bride. I buried her and John on that hillside." His expression softened as he looked at Eleanor. "And it's where I found you. I won't be driven away." Eleanor nodded, understanding. "Then we'll stand firm together." The weeks before Christmas brought heavy snow, making travel between town and the ranch difficult. Daniel managed the journey only once, bringing with him a small fir tree for Aunt Martha's parlor and a special gift for Eleanor, a delicate silver pendant that had belonged to his mother. "It's not much," he said as he fastened it around her neck, "but I'd be honored if you'd wear it." "It's beautiful," Eleanor said, touching the simple silver design. "I'll treasure it always." Christmas Day dawned clear and cold. The morning was spent at church, followed by a community dinner in the town hall. As twilight fell, Eleanor and Daniel slipped away for a private walk, wrapped warmly against the chill. "I have something to ask you," Daniel said as they paused in a quiet spot beneath the winter stars. Eleanor's heart quickened as he took both her hands in his. "Yes. These past months have been the happiest I've known in years." His blue eyes were serious in the fading light. "I know it hasn't been long by some standards, but out here, we learn to recognize what matters when we find it." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small ring, a simple gold band with a modest diamond. "Eleanor Davenport, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Joy burst through Eleanor like sunrise. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, Daniel, I will marry you." His face broke into that rare, transformative smile as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Then he gathered her into his arms and kissed her, no longer with the hesitation of their first kiss, but with the certainty of a future shared. Spring brought the wedding, a simple ceremony in Tombstone's small church with most of the town in attendance. Aunt Martha wept openly as Eleanor, radiant in a cream-colored dress, pledged her love to Daniel. Even some of the hardened miners and cowboys dabbed suspiciously at their eyes during the exchange of vows. The Templetons were conspicuously absent, having made their disapproval known through pointed social snubs in the preceding months. Their absence did nothing to dampen the celebration that followed, with music and dancing continuing well into the evening. As the festivities wound down, Eleanor and Daniel slipped away to begin their journey to the ranch, their home now. The cabin had been expanded over the winter months, with Daniel and neighbors adding a larger kitchen and a second bedroom for the future, as he had said with a meaningful smile. That night, as husband and wife, they discovered each other fully for the first time. Daniel's touch was gentle yet passionate, his reverence for Eleanor evident in every caress. For Eleanor, the physical expression of their love was a revelation, awakening sensations and emotions she had never imagined possible. Afterward, lying in each other's arms, Daniel traced the curve of her shoulder in the moonlight that filtered through the window. "Happy?" he asked softly. Eleanor smiled, nestling closer to him. "Completely, and you?" "More than I ever thought possible again." He kissed her forehead gently. "I used to think that happiness was something that happened to me once, and when it was gone, that was the end. Now I understand it can be found again, different but just as real. And just as precious," Eleanor added, understanding exactly what he meant. The years that followed brought both joys and challenges. The ranch prospered under their combined efforts, Daniel's practical knowledge and Eleanor's educated management, creating a more efficient operation than either could have achieved alone. The ongoing water rights dispute with the Templetons was finally resolved when George Templeton suffered financial reversals that forced him to scale back his ambitions. Eleanor continued teaching for 2 years, riding to town 3 days a week until the birth of their first child, a son they named William, after Daniel's father. 2 years later, a daughter joined the family, Rebecca Martha, named for the 2 strong women who had shaped their lives. On the 5th anniversary of the day Daniel had found Eleanor collapsed on the trail, they sat together on the porch of their expanded home, watching their children play in the yard while the sun set over the Arizona desert. "You ever miss it?" Daniel asked. "Teaching, town life?" Eleanor shook her head, leaning against his shoulder. "No, I visit enough to satisfy any craving for society, and I'm teaching our children, which is even more rewarding." She smiled up at him. "What about you? Do you ever regret taking in a half-dead stranger who complicated your peaceful existence?" Daniel laughed, the sound no longer rare as it once had been. "Best decision I ever made." He sobered slightly, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "Sometimes I think about how many small things had to happen exactly as they did. If you hadn't fought those robbers for your locket, if I hadn't decided to go to town that particular day, if I had taken a different trail home. We found each other against impossible odds," Eleanor said softly. "Some might call it fate. I call it the greatest blessing of my life," Daniel replied, kissing her gently. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared in the vast desert sky, they called the children in for supper. Their family gathered around the table in the warm light of the cabin that had once been a lonely man's refuge, and was now a home filled with love and laughter. Eleanor looked around at the faces of her husband and children, her heart full. The fever that had nearly claimed her life had instead led her to a love and a life beyond anything she could have imagined when she set out from Boston all those years ago. In the middle of nowhere, she had found everything that mattered: